My name is Don Emerson. I run the Southeast Asia program. Rethinking U.S.-Southeast Asia relations, the China factor and beyond. And as my colleague Cheng-Chwee said a little while ago, those three elements are very part and parcel of the discussion that we're going to have today. Southeast Asia, U.S. relations, the China factor, but also beyond. In other words, this will not be limited to the China factor in Southeast Asia. We're very fortunate to have two individuals who are extraordinarily well positioned, not only by scholarship, but by experience in dealing with this topic. I'm just briefly going to identify them and therefore not do them justice. There's just not enough time to go through all of the achievements that the two gentlemen on either side of me have managed to put together so far in their careers. I'll start alphabetically. Cheng-Chwee Kuik, to my left, Professor of International Relations, Head of the Center for Asian Studies at the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies in the National University of Malaysia, and a non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Institute of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. On my right, those are not political distinctions, on my right, David Shambaugh, Gaston Segur Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, whose China policy program he founded and directs. And each of these scholars has written widely on the seminar's topic. Recent examples include essays by Professor Kuik, for example, Explaining Hedging, key term, Explaining Hedging, the case of Malaysian equidistance, that's in process. Getting Hedging Right, a small state perspective, came out a couple of years ago. And a detailed report, recommendations of a working group on Southeast Asia led by Professor Shambaugh on my right, called Prioritizing Southeast Asia in American China Policy, which followed another book, I could go on and on, by Professor Shambaugh, Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia. I like that title particularly because it emphasizes the role of Southeast Asia as a location where these two powerful countries can come together and somehow interact. We'll see how well that image does in the course of the presentations that we're about to hear today. The plan is that each individual will speak briefly, present their particular point of view on this topic. There'll be a little bit of banter back and forth at this end of the room, but not too much. And then we will open it up for discussion. And I think we talked about this a few minutes ago. It's appropriate to start with David Shambaugh, because he has a presentation to make based on a report that he has just recently put together. And I think it will raise questions that can then be pursued in the ensuing discussion.
First, thank you, Don. And thank you to the Southeast Asia program of APARC here at Stanford for convening this session. And I'm just really delighted to be part of it. It's a coincidence that I'm here on campus this semester, or this half of academic year. But I'm really pleased also to share the session today. Share with my esteemed colleague and good friend Cheng-Chwee Kuik. We've become very relatively close friends and colleagues over the last 7 years. Why 7 years? Because we academics get sabbaticals every 7 years. Given on good behavior and earn them, they're not just given out. And that's the reason I'm here at Stanford. I'm here at the Hoover Institution for half of this academic year as a visiting fellow. The first half of the year at the Wilson Center in Washington. But 7 years ago, my previous sabbatical, I went to SAIS in Singapore at the invitation of Joe Liao and the Rajaratnam School. And it was just, I say this in all sincerity, I tell my friends, this is the best thing I ever did for myself. go to Southeast Asia and lived for most of that year, and then went back the following year for 3 more months. I have to say, 4 or 7 years ago, Southeast Asia was really terra incognita for me. I did not understand it very well at all. I've been to a few of the countries, but by no means all 10. And I have rather, superficial views of the region and seen largely from the outside in, you might say, from the United States and China and from the European Union. I've worked a lot in my career also in EU foreign policy. And the EU is very important as others in Southeast Asia. But spending 2 years in the region got me to look at the region from the inside out and from the outside in. So I wound up researching that book and publishing the book that Don just mentioned, For Great Power to Be, United States and China and Southeast Asia. And traveled to every one of the 10 countries. It was an extraordinary couple of years of deep dive into the region. Really regret that I hadn't spent more time in that part of the region earlier in my career. But better late than never, as they say. And it's now part of me intellectually and culturally and professionally for the rest of my career. That's going to be good. So I've been a Northeast Asia kind of guy primarily, but now I'm kind of around. So this has been a 7-year journey. I'm by no means an expert in Southeast Asia, but I'm a parachute scholar, you might say. I parachuted in. Okay, so in addition to the book, I led a working group that Don just mentioned, a working group of the Task Force on U.S.-China Policy that is co-chaired by Orville Schell, who's the director of the U.S.-China Center at the Asia Society in New York, and Susan Shirk, who just recently retired from an illustrious career at UC San Diego. That task force has been going on now for about 8 years. And over those 8 years, it has produced reports on different topics, different working groups on different topics. Well, we decided 2 years ago that Southeast Asia was worthy of a deep dive and a separate report, given its importance and the need to raise its importance in the consciousness of policymakers in Washington and across the United States more generally. Southeast Asia has been neglected in many ways. We can talk about this, I hope, today, the future of Southeast Asian studies. One thing the report discusses at the very end, Don just mentioned, Southeast Asia just hasn't, since the Vietnam War, has not gotten the kind of attention in American academia or think tanks that it should. Factoid, the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education has something called National Resource Centers, NRCs. There are 13 National Resource Centers devoted to China, Korea, and Japan. There are 6 devoted to Southeast Asia, so twice as many in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. We'll come back to that. But so what I'm going to do in what little time I have about this report, I just want to so we put out a report last summer, which I encourage you to go to the website of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. It's right there under reports, click, download, boom. Read it and carefully, hopefully. Worked hard on it. It was an 8-month-long project that included there are 6 members of our working group. I won't go through list all the members, but 6 or 7 of us. We went out to Singapore and had a really excellent 2-day conference at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies there. Cheng-Chwee was a participant in that. It was a listening tour, a listening conference for us Americans. We went out there intentionally to listen and to ask for criticism. We wanted feedback and criticism from our Southeast Asian colleagues on what we could do better, both just on the part of the United States generically what the United States could do better for itself in the region, but secondarily, what it could do better in order to compete with China in the region. So this report, that's what this report is all about. I'm going to give you just a few of the takeaways, top line sort of conclusions, excuse me, and encourage you to go to the website, again, Center for U.S.-China Relations, Asia Society, and read it for yourself. Well, so let me give you maybe half dozen of the major conclusions of the report. So I should say, this is a report written by Americans for Americans. Our Southeast Asian colleagues provided a lot of input into it, but it was not co-written with Southeast Asian colleagues. So this report is targeted at the United States government in Washington, and I personally briefed it at the White House, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at the Pentagon, at the CIA, at all the major institutions in the US government. So this report has landed on the proverbial right desks, whether it's been read. In fact, I know it has been read at pretty senior levels. So if it's having any effect on Southeast Asian policy, that's less clear. In fact, I can flag this now. Just last week, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore published its annual report on Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, what's the title of it?
State of Southeast Asia.
Right. So you should look at that website, SAIS. So this year's annual report, every year, they ask a series of questions. And this year's report had a couple of surprising takeaways, but there are problems with the survey itself. Nonetheless, the United States, for the first time, is evaluated at a lower level in terms of preference and trust than China, just slightly. So, and there's been a significant drop since last year. In 2023, 61% of respondents said they would prefer the United States if forced to choose. This is what Southeast Asians hate. They keep telling the world, don't make us choose between the United States and China. But if forced to choose, this survey forces the respondents to say, who would you choose? This year, for the first time, it was 50-50, basically. 50.5% said China, 49.5% said America. Last year, however, 61% said America, 38% said China. So something's happened in the last 12 months, just on that crude metric. There are many other questions asked that, again, I refer you to that website and that report for yourself. Let me come back to the Asia Society report and give you just sort of top line takeaways. So first one is that the United States, this is the most important generic point, the United States and China, at least from the American perspective, we are in a worldwide competition for influence. This is global, every continent, outer space, cyberspace, the Arctic, the Antarctic, you name it, US and China, that's the reality. Southeast Asia is only one of many geographic places in the world in which the US and China are competing for what? Competing for influence. Influence is the oldest concept in social science. Influence is hard to measure, different types, competing in different sectors for influence: economic sector, technological sector, cultural sector, political sector, diplomatic sector, security sector. Those are the big five sectors. The US and China, you could pick Latin America or Africa or any other place, and the US and China are competing in each of these, Middle East increasingly. So that's just a generic point. Southeast Asia is not unusual, but I argue in my book anyway, it's what I call the epicenter of this competition for influence between the two major powers. So it is a contested relationship. It's an interactive relationship, which is why I chose the subtitle, Where Great Powers Meet. Not a lot of cooperation going on between the US and China and Southeast Asia, although there is potential for it, particularly in the development assistance sphere, and in the public health sphere, and in the environmental sphere. With climate change. I'm not saying that there isn't potential for the US and China to do things together in conjunction with Southeast Asian actors, but primarily this is a interactive and competitive relationship. Second big takeaway point from the report is that the United States should view Southeast Asia on its own intrinsic merits, not solely through the prism of US-China competition. And the United States will do better in the US-China competition if it is not trying to counter China at every turn. If the United States just is the United States and just concentrates on what we can do and do well and do better, that's the best way to compete with China. Similarly, well, the United States makes mistakes. We've obviously got some work to do if these surveys are any indication. That's not unusual. But China makes mistakes too. Lots of them. In fact, I sleep well at night because I think China is its own worst enemy in international affairs. They step on other people's feet. They push others around. They undertake subversive united front activities in other countries. They manipulate media with disinformation. And they're increasingly, their military is an increasing concern in the Western Pacific. So, the Chinese, and not to mention debt trap diplomacy, the Chinese make their own mistakes. They do some things well, and they make mistakes. So I'll come back to that. Both the US and China has its own strengths and weaknesses. But for the Americans, we've got to not just see Southeast Asia as some sort of laboratory, petri dish, where we're competing with China, we're experimenting with China. That's not the way to approach the region at all. We have to see each of the 10 countries and ASEAN itself as an organization, its own intrinsic merits. Now, what does that mean? Well, ASEAN and its member states have a long history of colonialism and external intervention. They thus highly prize their independence and autonomy and are doing their very best to navigate this new phase. This is not the first time great powers have interacted in their neighborhood, and they are put in a position of maybe having to choose or navigate, as the word I like to use, this competitive rivalry. Now, Cheng-Chwee is the world's leading expert, quite seriously, on the concept of hedging, strategic hedging. I'm not trying to flatter him. He really is. So you're going to hear in a minute how Southeast Asians think about navigating this pincer movement between the two big powers. But my point here is that the Americans, or any external actor, would do well to understand the value placed by Southeast Asians on their own independence, their post-colonial identities. This is something I did not understand before 7 years ago in living out there. The whole power is just deeply embedded in the DNA of these societies. If you don't understand that, you don't understand much about Southeast Asia. So, third point is that this, in terms of international politics, so to speak, or the competition between the United States and China, that's not the only way to look at the region, because it's not just a dyadic competition. The United States and China are only two of several powers that are active in the region, so-called middle powers, namely Australia, the European Union, India, Japan, and South Korea is a wannabe middle power. I was in the audience in Singapore when the former president came down from Seoul to launch his Southeast Asia initiative, 5 years ago or something. Anyway, the point is, this is a complex chessboard. It's not just a question of the US and China. It's a question of these other middle powers that I just mentioned, plus ASEAN itself. Very complicated to intellectually kind of grasp these different actors, but it's a multi-actor region. That's the point. It's not just a dyadic, bipolar competition. Now, I'd say something about strengths and weaknesses. of the US and China. So both have strengths and both have weaknesses. China's strengths, I would argue, lie in its geographic proximity, its huge economic footprint, its Belt and Road Initiative, its intensive bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, its cultural linkages, and its values neutral and transactional political approach to the region, and its propaganda narratives, which actually have traction in the region. So that's what I say are on the strength side of the ledger for China. What about the weakness side of the ledger for China? I would identify, ironically, geographical proximity. China's too close for comfort. Every conversation I have with Southeast Asians, what's the first thing they'll do? They point upwards. Like there's China up there. It's just like a huge thundercloud hanging over the region. So proximity, yes, it facilitates a lot of economic interaction, a lot of cultural interaction, but cuts the other way too. It's a little too close for comfort for a lot of Southeast Asians. China also pressures ASEAN and its member states, practices coercive diplomacy in the region. Its illegal claims and expansionist island building in the South China Sea is a definite weakness. Its rapid military buildup and huge naval, coast guard, and maritime militia presence, and potential for a real naval base in Siem Reap, not Siem Reap, in Cambodia. Its politically subversive United Front, Tongjiang activities, and relatively weak security assistance programs for regional militaries. China doesn't do much of anything in the security assistance realm, except for Myanmar and Cambodia. Now, what about the United States? I would just summarize quickly. American strengths in the region. Number one, extensive security assistance and military-to-military ties. And that comes through in the ISIS survey we asked about American security presence. All something like 68 to 70% of respondents said very positive. We want the United States here. So that's a strength. Not just soldiers and ships. When I say security assistance, I'm talking about a range of activities of training, some of which takes place at the Asia Pacific Security Center in Honolulu, by the way. It's a wonderful institution. Other strengths of the US, substantial foreign direct investment. Well, that may surprise you. My favorite statistic in Southeast Asia, American FDI, the cumulative stock of American FDI in Southeast Asia is greater than Japan, China, and South Korea combined. I'll let that soak in for a minute. Why, it's such a stunning statistic. Yeah, $329 billion for the United States, and China's cumulative FDI stock is about $130 billion. And on an annual flow basis, won't surprise you, Americans invest more in Southeast Asia than does China, not counting Hong Kong pass-through money, which is okay. So I would say we know a lot about China's economic influence and footprint. ASEAN is now China's leading trade partner, number one. It's overtaken the European Union. It's now over $1 trillion a year in trade. But the Americans aren't so shabby either. $500 billion, $500 billion. And 6,200 American companies operate across the region. So the American commercial, and it's a kind of apples and oranges question in the business. Chinese are in certain sectors, Americans are in other sectors. Then I would argue that America's soft power appeal has slipped, to be sure. That's measurable in these surveys since the Trump years. And cultural and educational exchange programs are not what they should be. But nonetheless, there is a kind of intrinsic respect for the US amongst the publics and middle classes and intellectuals in Southeast Asia. So the US scores are. Okay. Then lastly, weaknesses. What about the US? Well, its weaknesses are the episodic nature of its high level of diplomacy. We call this parachute diplomacy, fly in, fly out. Secretary of State flies in, visits maybe 3 countries, if he's lucky, or she. one or two, there's a couple of speeches, flies out, inexcusable. So our Secretary of State, at least, and high-level officials are seen to be absent. That may be an oxymoron. They're not seen, that's the point. And there's American weaknesses, very insufficient public diplomacy. Our PD work is abysmal. Sorry, Laura. It needs a lot of work. And I briefed this to EAP directly on the subject. I don't know how receptive they were, but American weaknesses are impatience with the slow, consensual ASEAN way of diplomacy, our absence from regional economic groupings and FTAs. That's a huge weakness. IPEF is not well understood and not very respected in Southeast Asia. And we Americans cannot compete with China in the infrastructure domain. So those are weak. Each of these powers, as I say, have their strengths and have their weaknesses. But the best thing the Americans can do is not try to counter China directly. Work on these weaknesses. Every one of those 6 weaknesses I just mentioned requires resources, human resources, investment, time. And the United States should also actively support increased regional engagement by Australia, Canada, Europe, India, Japan, and South Korea, those other middle powers. Why? Because they're all democracies. They are multipliers for American values. We share things in common with those 5 countries in the region. And there's strength in numbers. If you add those 5 plus the United States together, and then you put China on the other side, does China have any countries in the region or any other middle powers that are aligning with it? Answer, no. So this is a kind of counterintuitive narrative I'm trying to paint for you. The United States is, in fact, in a stronger position in Southeast Asia than it's often given credit for. That's maybe the last point. It's not well known in the region what the United States does there. Public diplomacy has to be prioritized much more. We have to tell Southeast Asians what we do there and why it's good for them, not in a hectoring lecturing way like I just did, but to help appreciate. They just have no idea what the United States is involved in. So diplomacy, we have to increase PD. We have to improve our intelligence collection in the region. We have to improve, one of the things we found in our report, we have to improve something like this, U.S. Embassy personnel. We're understaffed and understaffed, under-resourced, and our poor, overworked foreign service officers, who are very, very capable professionals, are overworked and under-resourced and don't get out of their buildings into the societies as much as they should. But they're all doing 3 jobs when they should be doing 1. So the embassy component that needs ramping up. Intelligence needs ramping up. PD needs ramping up. Educational exchange programs need ramping up. There are currently 55,000 Southeast Asian students in American universities. That should be, we argue in the report, should be increased to 75,000 by the year 2030. And the number of scholarships should be provided for these students because Southeast Asian families can't afford the high cost of American tuition. So it requires the Department of Education to get involved. Fulbright is another one of our strengths. But we've got to build up, I keep saying this is the last point, we've got to build up Southeast Asian studies here in the United States on American campuses. So we have to go from the current 6 NRCs up to at least 10. And I think I'll stop. There are other suggestions we make in the report. I've run on too long, but I'll let you read for yourself. So the United States' hand in Southeast Asia is not a weak one. I would say it's an underappreciated one. We can do better? Absolutely, we can do better. That's why we do reports like this. we hope that our government pays attention. But judging from this year's SAIS survey, it went down 25%. There's one question here about American diplomacy. Has it improved, stayed the same, or declined over the last 12 months? And the answer to that was declined. 21%. Rob, in 1 year. You know, I don't know what that reflects. The fact that Anthony Blinken hasn't been in Southeast Asia for a year, I'm not sure he has been. But there's something going on here, which I think really has a lot to do with PD, getting the word out. And if we can do better on that front, we can advance our own interests and we can compete better with China. Okay, sorry for going on too long. But
Not at all, not at all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Very good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Let me begin by thanking Dawn for having me here. It's a great pleasure and also an honor to join both Dawn and also David here. As we know, they are both giants in our field. Of course, respectively, China studies and also Southeast Asian studies. So if 10, 15 years ago, someone would tell me that I would join these two giants at Stanford for this panel, I would say that this would be just a dream. And I'm glad that Dawn made this dream happen, even though I did not kind of imagine. Yeah. And having said that, let me say that speaking after David is a tall order. And the only way, I think the only possible way for me to add value, if at all, after David's excellent remarks, would be just to provide a small state perspective, a Southeast Asian perspective with my very strong Malaysian accent. So towards the end, if you don't like my points, I hope you do like my Malaysian accent. So with that in mind, let me make my 3 points for today's conversation. And the 3 points that I'm going to share will be structured very much with what Dawn has kind of structurally presented in the title. US-Southeast Asia relations, China factor, and then beyond. Yeah. So first thing first, on US-Southeast Asia relations, of course, it's a complex relationship. I think all relationships are complex in their own way. US-Southeast Asia relationship is very, very complex, then, now, and also a future. Within the minutes that I have, I thought to capture the complexity of US-Southeast Asia relations, the only possible way is to talk about 3 A's. The first A, asymmetry, and that is something that Don started by his 2020 book, right? The Deer and the Dragon. Asymmetry. Cut the long story short, asymmetry in international relations simply means vast power gap. US is the strongest power in the world. Southeast Asian countries, all 10 of us, or maybe 11 if you add the Timor-Leste, are very small, some smaller than the others. We are weaker states, we are smaller states. And this is not going to change whoever are the president or prime ministers, either in the cross-ASEAN capital or in Washington, D.C. We accepted that asymmetry, power asymmetry will be a permanent reality in the relationship. With that A, asymmetry brings to the second A and also the third A. What are the second A and third A? This is very much the second A and third A will be something that echoing what David has beautifully presented, right? And the second A and third A are about attractions, but also anxieties. And attractions and anxieties are the two sides of the asymmetry coin. You can use that to visualize and talk about US-Southeast Asia relations. The same can be said about China-Southeast Asia relations. If you can only talk about 3 points, that would be the 3A that would focus about US-Southeast Asia relations. How so? And there are so many ways to elaborate, but let's talk about the attraction first, right? US as the only superpower in the post-colonial era is very attractive for smaller countries, weaker countries, not only in Southeast Asia, but across the globe. And to capture again the attractions, there are so many ways. David early on talked about soft power, right? That is certainly true. In fact, the joke in Kuala Lumpur and also Jakarta is that there are some Muslim friends who would do some protest demonstration in front of US embassies for Gaza, for many other things. But the next thing that they're going to do is to go for Hollywood movies, go for American culture, and maybe standing back in the same place, American embassy, to get a visa, either for themselves or for their children's education. So that kind of a soft power is an indicator of how attractive American power still be. It can be ambivalent, but will always be very attractive. And it would be wrong and incomplete to say that it is only about soft power. There are many other aspects of American powers that continue to attract hard power, military prowess and all that, so powerful. For China or for many other reasons, Southeast Asian countries, not all, but some will still think that we need to leverage on American military power in one way or another. Some would have it very openly, Philippines, and then to some extent, Singapore also leverage it. Of course, Singapore-US relationship is not alliance, but it's a alignment without alliance. Other countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Muslim majority countries, we can be very critical about US for a number of reasons, but we continue to maintain long-standing defense partnership with Uncle Sam. This is not going to change in India. So other than soft power, hard power, there are also technology power and also a number of technical issues that continue to bind and attract Southeast Asia with US. We are in the Bay Area, so the technological power is something that we do not need to elaborate. But let me quickly move on to the next side of the same coin. Attraction clearly is one aspect of US Southeast Asia relationship, but everything goes both ways, right? On the other side of attraction are anxiety, apprehensive, and some are more apprehensive than the others. CLMV countries, the new member countries of ASEAN organization, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and also Vietnam, in one way or another, they do see Washington, D.C. As a source of political challenges, right? Every year, for example, there will be human rights reports and all that. The elites in those capital will be very, very uncomfortable. It is not just CLMV countries, the all member countries as well, in one point or another, are also worried about US statements that might undermine the political authority in Southeast Asia. Even Singapore, if you are, today we don't talk about it, but those who have a longer memory remember that in the early 1990s, for example, there was a huge debate about the Asian values, right? So Singapore saw US as a challenge, and then later part of 1990s, we also know that in Malaysia, at the height of reformasi, when US condemned Mahathir, the way he treated Anwar Ibrahim, and today Anwar Ibrahim is the prime minister, but still, I think countries across the region do feel that even though we don't have to worry about US militarily, but the political aspect is certainly a source of kind of anxieties. And it is not just the political aspect, and you don't have to be do something intentionally. Some unintended actions on the part of Washington, D.C. do also raise some anxiety in one way or another. For example, the current context, US-China rivalry will continue for a long time. And we are not worried about US might harm us intentionally, but we are still worried that US policy vis-a-vis China, the big powers are competing, would one way or another entrap us into military conflict that we do not want and we do not choose. And we are more worried about the consequences, not necessarily about the intention. So those are the aspects that will continue to push us to be kind of worried about US actions in one way or another. We will say that we want to leverage, but we do not want to go too far. So it means that we will continue to invest eggs in US basket in one way or another, for security, for prosperity, and also for autonomy. Having a more balanced relationship, diversified relationship, both strategically and development, is always good for smaller countries. But we are not going to put all eggs in any big powers basket. This is so true for US-Southeast Asia relationship. It is certainly true also for China-Southeast Asia relationship. So don't worry, we are not going to put all eggs unless we are being pushed in one way or another, which brings me to the second issue of the China factor. Yeah, of course, if I'm lazy, I can still talk about the 3 A's that happen applicable completely for a China-Southeast Asia relationship. But I do not want to plagiarize myself. So let me talk about 3 different alphabets. 3 points, same alphabet for China factor. If 3 A's explain, capture US Southeast Asia relation very, very well, I would say 3 P's would be a good, accurate, and I would say a prevalent to talk about the China factor in US Southeast Asia relationship. What are the 3 P's? The first P, push. China's action in one way or another is pushing Southeast Asian countries to align with the US in one way or another, some closer than the other. So it used to be in 1990s and also 2000, we said we used the phrase, right? Charm offensive to describe China-Southeast Asia relationship. Charm offensive, small diplomacy where China enthusiastically show the persuasive and also the economic attraction to Southeast Asian countries. And not only that, also strengthen a number of bilateral and also multilateral diplomatic relationships. Charm offensive. But today, and this one if I can cite my friend Yin's story, he was the one after 2010 say that today, and that he said that in 2010, today is 2024, remain true. China has become more offensive than charm. So from charm offensive to more offensive than charm. So that is a very good point for us to remind. The more China become assertive and aggressive over South China and several others, the more China's action is pushing Southeast Asian countries closer to the United States. So I certainly echo what David mentioned earlier on when he said that China is its own enemy in one way or another. So push, that's the first P. Then again, this yin and yang, right? It will always be 2 sides of many things. Now, having emphasized about push, let's also turn on to the second P, pull. However anxious and also uncomfortable and worried Southeast Asian countries might have about China, there will always be a set of factors that will pull Southeast Asia not going too far. Philippines perhaps is the only exception for their own bilateral and various regional dynamics. But for other countries, even Vietnam, Vietnam is the master of hedge in our time. Right? Where else last year? Where else do you have a smaller country without any official open invitation to attract the president of the United States and the president of China to come and visit? Even Hanoi, right? However uncomfortable they are about China's action over the South China Sea and also many other things, they continue to make sure that let's not going too far by putting all eggs in the US basket. They continue to send signal to China. What are the factors that pull Southeast Asian countries to be not going too far? There are a number of things. Economic importance, already I mentioned. I would say proximity is also another big factor that important for us to understand that. I think David highlighted about how proximity goes both ways, right? Very true. Too close to be comfort. But on the other hand, imagine yourself, if you are elites, you are leaders of smaller countries in Southeast Asia, when you look at China, big power, all the 3A happen and applies to China. But you also know that China-Southeast Asia relationship and US-Southeast Asia relationship is different in one fundamental aspect, which is proximity, geographical proximity, and China is a permanent factor. China is a permanent factor in Southeast Asia's external environment. That is not going to change. We are at the interpersonal level, we say that you can choose your friends. You cannot choose your neighbor. So true for international relations. So every ASEAN countries will remind that other powers come and go. You can announce a pivot, rebalancing, Indo-Pacific, you can add the different layers, but we also know that we can't afford to be too confrontational against China. Why? China will always be a giant next door. And that even before China becomes so powerful, we already knew that we need to have a very good collaboration, or at least stable and productive as possible. Yeah? So the second P will be the pull factor. So you say push and pull, and then what are we going to have? So the third P is very, very important. Politics. Politics of trade-off and politics of offset. Smaller countries can be weak actors, but they are not silly or stupid actors. They do their own calculation. We push and pull and all that. They will say that net effect is that other than avoiding putting all eggs in any basket, other than ensuring that we are not going to side with one over the other, we need to do something that Don has mentioned in his early work very well. Defiance and deferences. It's too deep. Again, it's a human behavior, right? Human behavior vis-a-vis stronger actor, right? And smaller countries for survival. For survival, we know that we need to do both defiance and deference in order to make sure that we will be a survive. However, the relationship between the two giants evolve. And we do that concurrently, we do that selectively. Again, to present these 2 points, I would say enduring human wisdom in all societies, is that defiance is to say no and showing autonomy. You are small, but you do not want to be pushed around. Not to be pushed around by Washington, not to be pushed around by China or any other countries. Defiance. Deference is the opposite. Saying yes, why not? But also showing respect, right? So this is the defiance and deference that small countries in Southeast Asia will do that vis-a-vis Washington, will do that vis-a-vis Beijing. So meaning that we can't afford to keep saying yes to US, to China. We also cannot afford to keep saying no to US and China. Why is that? Complete defiance. It will provoke suspicion and alienation and confrontation and hostility to either power. But complete deference, keep saying yes, you will result in loss of autonomy, subservient, so on and so forth, and dependency. Which brings me to my final point about the beyond part, right? And this is what Don reminded me early on before this session begin. So given the time, let me have a very quick version of the third point, right? The beyond. So we have 3 A's for US Southeast Asia relations. We have 3 P's for China factor. So what about the beyond? 3 points. 3 quick point that same alphabet. D, right? 3D. And I'm not going to worry you too much. The 3D is very simple. It's about domestic. One blind spot in a big power, smaller state, the relationship in the Western, the mainstream circle is that we assume that as China's power grows, smaller countries in Southeast Asia in China's shadow of proximity and all that would be worried about China so much that it's about China, and China. Then in Southeast Asia, our responses is that actually this is a misunderstanding. It's partially correct, but also partially wrong. Why is that? Empirically, we know that the leaders of smaller countries in Southeast Asia and beyond, every day when they wake up, they are not thinking about China. They are not thinking about China, US, China, who is going to be more powerful than the others. Those are structural. But rather, leader of Southeast Asia wake up every day. They are thinking about domestic. Southeast Asia is a region where diversity is a big factor within boundary and across the boundary. The current so-called ASEAN peace, we never take things for granted. Some might assume that the ASEAN countries, as members of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, we are like buddies, like in one group. We are not taking for granted. We do know that there are intra-ASEAN differences and problems. They will continue to be there. We are not going to clash with each other, but there are some issues that among us. More importantly, the diversity within the boundaries. Every country, right? Identity politics is a big issue that every ruling elites are more concerned rather than the external power relationship. Domestically also means that performance legitimacy. Whether you are democratic countries, authoritarian countries, or somewhere in between, all government elites in Southeast Asia, they do know that they need to ensure performance in order to justify their rule, their right to rule over their own countries. So with that 3 A's, three P's and also three B's. Let me stop here, and I hope you do enjoy both my points and also my accent. Thank you very much.
Well, that was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I think we agreed earlier that there would be a little bit of chance for interaction at this end of the room before we open it up. We don't have that much time, so I think we want to be fairly brief about that so that we can allow for maximum interaction with you. Having said that, let me just draw a crude contrast between two zones of concern, if I can use that phrase. We just heard the threes, this is a two. The two zones of concern, economy and security. Now, I think it is fair to say that most academic observers, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, looking at the topic of our conversation here today, would say that with regard to security, the American presence in Southeast Asia, the American policies towards Southeast Asia, are relatively more effective and more appreciated than the counterpart set of policies associated with economy. And here I'm talking particularly about economic growth. We could get into the implications of economic growth for the survival of the planet. That's a different issue. And an important issue that we, if you want to discuss, we certainly could. And there are many examples. The Indo-Pacific, we haven't talked about the Indo-Pacific, but in some sense, one might almost say that Southeast Asia has so many problems that it becomes even more massively challenging to extend the zone of concern all the way to Mozambique, right? Because that's the space we're talking about, right? From Africa all the way to to Japan. And part of that is a policy effort. I think it's really, of course, accurately characterized as an effort rather than a clearly developed and developing policy, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, offered by the United States to kind of make up for the absence of a trade-based economic initiative. And of course, the countries in Southeast Asia are particularly interested in trade, and related to that, of course, investment and so forth. And I wonder if either of the speakers would comment, either to disagree with me, or if you do find that persuasive, what can be done on the economic side to improve America's position, if you will, or its involvement, its contribution to Southeast Asia. And then on the security side, well, that's obviously a very broad and complicated zone. So my temptation is to shrink it to the South China Sea and to argue that the most dangerous place in Southeast Asia today, from the standpoint of international conflict, is the South China Sea. And I say this because if we were sitting in Beijing, if this was the Politburo, right, assuming that Xi Jinping allowed us to speak independently, he would be here, obviously, so that wouldn't be a problem. In that context, China can do several things. Number one, most drastically, China can prevent the resupply of Second Thomas Shoal, which is part of the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone of the Philippines, and which has been a site for what one, I think, charitably would have to say, at least politely, are expressions of violence. Several, 3 to 5, I get different numbers, Filipino sailors on Filipino ships have been hurt, have suffered damage from being the recipients of blasted water, right, from water cannons that are coming from what China calls the Coast Guard, which is in fact, a kind of cover term for a navy, because these Coast Guard ships are gigantic, they have weapons and so forth and so on. And so if China decides to prevent the resupply or even go beyond that, because when you resupply, you simply send another person comes out, one goes in, and maybe you're sending food for the people on the Sierra Madre, which is the ship that is sinking into oblivion, which marks part of the Philippines' legally, it seems to me, quite acceptable claim to its own exclusive economic zone. But if you do repair, that's different, because the ship will eventually disintegrate, and China will, in that sense, have won. And so China does not want repair. They have, begrudgingly allowed some transfer of individuals back and forth. But then China adopts a policy that's saying, no, we will prevent repair. That could initiate a response, not only from the Philippines, but a military response from the United States, given that the United States has made it quite clear to the Philippines that our relationship, our treaty with them, would in fact apply to damage done to the Philippines by China, especially that kind of damage. Now, I'm talking too much here. All three of us perhaps are talking too much, but I'd be curious to know, again, what is to be done, right? Lenin's question, right? Что делать? What is to be done with regard to preventing the outbreak of war in the South China Sea? I don't know if you want to answer that or you want to just open it up. What do you think? Should we just open it up? Or?
Cheng-Chwee and I can try and respond.
Okay,
perhaps a bit.
Sure.
You want to go first?
You should go first. By the authority.
Well, I don't have an answer to your final question there, Don, about how to keep conflict from continuing, but one thing you nor I mentioned was American freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs.
Right.
I think that is one way to deter potential conflict and to enforce international law. The United States Navy is capable of patrolling through the South China Sea and well into the Indo-Pacific Ocean and worldwide. So that's a common good, I would think, that the Southeast Asians would share with the Americans. Chinese don't share it because they think it's a Chinese lake. And they are in 100% violation of international law in the Hague Tribunal ruling. So again, that comes back to public. Another way to deter an outbreak of conflict is in the public relations domain, public diplomacy. I can't overemphasize this enough. Not only does the United States need to do a much better job on a variety of fronts, I'm talking about what it does, the United States does in the region. The United States also needs to call China out on what malign activities it does, including in the South China Sea. This is an egregious, almost as egregious case as the Ukraine invasion by Russia and Putin. China's violation of the Hague Tribunal decision, the island building, and now the militarization of those islands. So, it's not in the media enough, and the American government doesn't say enough about it, and other governments don't say enough about it. So other governments have a stake in the PD dimension of this issue. So I would say the way to deter the South China Sea is maintain a naval presence, freedom navigation operations, not just unilateral, but bilateral and multilateral. So to the extent that Southeast Asian navies can join the US Navy, so much the better. That's on your last question.
Good.
As I was thinking about, you asked us to respond about security and economics. I would say on the American side, the security cooperation is America's best strength. I said that in the presentation. And it's not just the American, I didn't say security presence, I said cooperation, because that's what security assistance is. The United States works with others throughout Southeast Asia, and far, far more extensively than China. China doesn't have any security assistance, except for Cambodia and Myanmar. That's it. The United States is deeply embedded with except for Myanmar, providing what you might call the software of security, not the hardware of security and weapons.
We're going to have to.
So that's, I would say, keep it up. On the economic side, I would just note it's a really unknown story, the American commercial presence. And it's, as I said, not apples, it is apples and oranges. The Chinese work in infrastructure space, IT space, dam building, which you wrote a book about. You know, the American corporate presence in Southeast Asia emphasizes financial services, consulting services, insurance, healthcare, consumer goods, aircraft, energy, IT, e-commerce. China is not active, except for IT and Huawei, is not active in any of those spheres. So the Americans do certain things in Southeast Asia, and the Chinese do other things. So it's a kind of a division of labor. It's not. So we need to just keep doing the things we're doing well, and to publicize it.
Right. Nicely put. You have any comment?
Yeah, sure. Quick one.
Yeah.
David has captured, I think, most of the important dynamics. The only aspect that I can complement and also kind of add values perhaps is to provide again small state perspective. So from smaller countries' point of view, big power interaction, especially how they compete and whether or not the competition will evolve into conflict, is something that we say is structural, right? Structural meaning that it's not up to smaller countries and all that. We learn from history and how we see US-China contemporary competition. For us, is like this is not new. It's a latest version of a historic recurring dynamics in the sense that it is in big powers' DNA to compete. Colonization and Second World War and all that, we saw that is very much a product of a big power competition. US-China contemporary competition is really the latest around. But are we saying like we can't do nothing because it's structured and then we do nothing? Certainly the answer is no. I think we have been doing a lot, sometimes quietly, sometimes too quiet, and then it might raise a lot of misinterpretation. David and Don was very kind of early on to mention about the hedging aspect, and this is something that Southeast Asia we try to adapt to the power dynamics by doing something that we never announced. Nobody would say that we are doing a hedging policy because they would defeat the purpose, increasing risk rather than reducing or mitigating risk. So we would just do it without saying that what we are doing is hedging, but you do know that hedging is widely misunderstood. Hedging is widely misunderstood in the sense that most people, either academic or policy maker, would say that hedging is too opportunistic. Hedging, it's indecisive, and hedging is about speculative, right? But if you talk to people in the region, policymakers especially, they will tell you that these are all misunderstandings. Mainly, we don't have time to talk about speculative or also indecisive and all that. But one point to emphasize is that we certainly do not think that this is a speculative. Hedging is actually not about making speculation. It's about avoiding speculation. We do not know whether or not US-China rivalry will escalate into military confrontation. We do not know whether China will become even more aggressive. We do not know whether US commitment to regional security will continue. We have all these concerns even well before Trump 1.0. And in light of the possibility of Trump 2.0, we do know that those will continue to be concerned. And so it's about the what if issue. Hedging is that you are not going to make any speculation. What would emerge? But to avoid speculation, what you need to do is that to do what Don tells us to do, right? Selective defiance and selective deference to both of them. You position, but in a way, you also know that there is a point, there might be a point of time, we might not have a space to do that anymore. But again, those will be a structural issue, not just for Southeast Asia, but for every country.
Well said. Comments, question? Yeah, please.
I think you mentioned earlier of the drop in sort of like perception of the US, especially in the last year, 10 percentage point drop. I was just wondering, what do you think is behind this drop, and do you think whether this is a blip or this is a trend going forward?
Well, do you mind if I? Please. Okay. All right. It's a fascinating question, and actually, it would take a lot of time to go into all the details, which include methodological details with regard to how that survey has been conducted. Serious methodological details, right? If this were a graduate student writing a dissertation for me, I would ask for some revisions, methodological revisions, which we can get into perhaps afterwards if you want, but not now. A couple of things. You know, David's presentation was balanced. There is concern because of that drop, that decline that you just referenced. But at the same time, I think David acknowledges what the US is doing for the better. And in that latter context, the more optimistic context, there are just a couple of things that need to be said. First of all, with regard to the drop in US attractiveness, to use one of your A's, right? The decline in US attractiveness between 2024 and 2023. It's important to keep in mind a couple of things, and I'll just try to be brief here. I recommend you read this in detail. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. It comes out every year and it's very informative, despite the methodological problems, okay? Now, number one, roughly 2,000 individuals filled out the questionnaire. I'm not exactly sure the process, whether it was done, over the phone, probably not. It was probably maybe even face-to-face, I'm not sure. But in any case, 2,000 respondents. Who were those respondents? The ISIS typically organizes them in terms of profession. There's some journalists. These are elite individuals, so-called, right? These are people who potentially could influence foreign policy. This is not somebody taken off the street, okay? And one category among those respondents is business people. Now, I just want to say that the proportion of business people in this particular exercise was increased substantially. Hypothesis. I'm not saying this is true or false. I'm saying it's worth looking into. Hypothesis. Business people in Southeast Asia interact extensively with China because, China is there. That's another one of your P's. You have three. There's a fourth one, which you mentioned, permanent. So if you're a businessman in Southeast Asia, your attitude towards China may be influenced by the relative commercial success that you have dealing with China. Possibility, and I'll stop here. Possibility number two, Gaza. Now, Gaza is a long way from Southeast Asia, but the American image has unquestionably undergone damage because of Biden's support for Israel. And this is evidenced if you break down the contributions, the statements, the answers that are being made to the survey. You will find that in Muslim majority countries, there are three Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, right? As I'm sure you know, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. And the response to the US, whether it's, popularity, trust, whatever, has definitely been affected by opinion in those Muslim majority countries. So, the abstract statistics need to be broken down in, specifics, right? And I think you come up with a picture that is perhaps a little bit less upsetting than the one if you just concentrate on the drop. I'm sorry, that's a long answer. I hope that helps. Do you mind? Is that okay? I'm sorry. Okay, I'm supposed to be a moderator, and I'm being I'm sorry. I apologize. Any other comments or questions?
Some of the older members of the audience may remember that 50 years ago we were exiting a very painful chapter of U.S. relations with Southeast Asia, and when I heard some of the discussion earlier by the professor about treating Southeast Asian countries as individual countries rather than throwing around terms like the domino theory and deterrence, et cetera. And I'm wondering, what lessons do you take from the Vietnam era that you think would be applicable to developing our relations with the Southeast Asian countries?
Good question.
Interesting. Well, yeah, gosh, just start with the domino theory. On the one hand, I think history shows that it was correct with regard to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. What happened after Vietnam succeeded in unifying the country and taking over the South? Next thing they did was to invade Cambodia and create a kind of protectorate state in Laos. So that was the premise of Robert McNamara. I hate to say it. That happened. So, but I'm not saying that the Vietnam War is therefore excusable. But what we did not appreciate was the fact that Vietnam and its neighbors in Indochina, that Vietnam, well, Cambodia in particular, were independent actors themselves. So Vietnam had to invade Cambodia in order to, extend its hegemony over into Indochina. So that's a lesson that Americans had no sensitivity to back in the 70s when we were fighting the Vietnam War. But I don't know, other takeaways from that era are with respect to China. We assumed that Vietnam was a proxy for Beijing and for Moscow. That was another one of Robert McNamara's assumptions. Well, it turns out that it wasn't. That there was a national revolution going on in that society and in that country that Beijing and Moscow supported, yes, and benefited from, yes, but it was indigenous. And the United States didn't, understand that from the get-go, and it cost us 75,000 American casualties and lost influence for a long time. But if you fast forward 50 years from then to now, Vietnam is one of America's strongest partners in the region. That's just astounding. Why? Well, for several reasons, I would say. Efforts, in fact, by McNamara and Giap and others after the war ended to kind of revisit the assumptions during the war and to learn the lessons on both sides from the war. So there was a lot of memory work done, so to speak, I think, that was very constructive, that has led to the normalization of relations, not just diplomatic, but really society to society relations. And China. So we Americans and the US government didn't understand the depth of what adjective to use, discontent and hostility on the part of the Vietnamese towards China, which had occupied it for over 1,000 years. And that dynamic is still at the heart of regional politics, the China-Vietnam dynamic. So, Americans just didn't, despite all the money we put into Southeast Asian studies back in the 70s, we didn't understand some very basic things about Southeast Asia. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
I think that we didn't understand it back then. We thought these countries would become proxies for China. But now if the theme is, should we pressure these countries to choose, maybe we ought to rethink about that dynamic and say, no, they really don't want to be too close to China, but we have to accept where they are. So therefore we have to be willing to be a little less dogmatic about them choosing one way or another.
Americans have many problems, but one of them is a black-white view of the world, zero-sum view of the world. We tend to categorize, countries into two categories: friends and not friends. That's not the way to look at Southeast Asia. That's the whole point of our report, my comments. We just have to avoid that. They don't want to choose, and we should not put them in a position where it seems that the Americans are forcing them into a choice. That will have a counterproductive effect. So we have to understand the diversity in the region. That's job one. Very diverse region. It's not, we use the shorthand term Southeast Asia. Well, we all need shorthands in life. However, is there really a Southeast Asia? Well, there's a question for it. Besides a geographic designation, it's so diverse that we have to understand every single one of the societies, and even within the societies. What Cheng-Chwee was saying about domestic politics in your own country, in Malaysia.
I agree. Any other comments or remarks?
If not, I have a question for my colleague. If I could ask you, Cheng-Chwee,
Sure.
for some advice for the United States. What advice would you give the U.S. on how, not whether, but how to pursue our values that we cherish in the region? Freedoms of all kinds, democracy, and human rights. The shorthand would be Southeast Asia say, just get out of here. We don't want to hear about any of that. Well, I'm sorry. We are not being true to ourselves as Americans anywhere in the world if we do not advocate for these values that we hold dear. The question is not whether, but how. What advice would you have from a Southeast Asian perspective to affect more effectively? If you think we should say anything or do anything, should we just put money into NGOs and help build civil society in the region? And the US government should shut up? Or what advice do you have?
Right. Thanks very much, David. This is certainly the most difficult question that I have ever faced in all sense. So to provide a quick response to a very difficult question, I would say that, again, it's not about either or. It's not about either US government should pursue this or not. In my earlier presentation, I did highlighted some aspect of it when I reminded everybody that even Singapore, one of the strongest partners of United States in the region, early on also faced some similar challenges when the value-based policy was being introduced by United States at the early immediate post-Cold War era. It created a lot of political issues. And ironically or interestingly, there was also the time where Singapore said that when US was retreating militarily from Philippines, we won it, right? And that was the starting point of a US-Singapore defense partnership. So that shows the ambivalent aspect. We do understand that for domestic reason and also the value kind of laden foreign policy approach of the United States, it's an important element of a US policy. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, if you talk to even countries which are democratic in nature, right? And we will say that emphasis about human rights, value-based, and human dignity are always very important. But for practical reasons, let's not put this as the number one criteria or number one guiding principle, because we are going to create a lot of issues. And we say that not necessarily just because of US Southeast Asia. Even among Southeast Asia, right? You see we have 10 ASEAN countries. And then we understand that the issue of a political system, democratic or non-democratic, is something that almost like given. We are not interested in changing, for example, our socialist, non-democratic countries. We have to live with that. Yeah? And we know that this is something that is important for various reasons. But if you put this as number one criteria or guiding principle, you are going to create a lot of issues. Final point to make is to relate to the current Indo-Pacific framework, something that Don highlighted earlier on. Biden administration had a lot of kind of policy components for this Indo-Pacific strategy. One component is democracy, the summit of democracies. And then this is an extension of one big component of Indo-Pacific strategy among Quad and also US is that like-minded countries. And then this is a time where we see democracies versus autocracies, right? This started well before Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also continued. This issue of a very clear-cut democracies versus autocracies was very straightforward for transatlantic relationship and also US allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan, very straightforward. Democracies versus autocracies. But in Southeast Asia and others, the rest of global South, it's very complicated in the sense that whenever we heard about like-minded, right, we will smile. We'll smile because of when like-minded is so straightforward for US allies in Europe and Asia, it is completely not straightforward elsewhere. It's shades of gray rather than a black and white. Quick example, quick evidence and so indicators is that the Summit of Democracies will help twice. Only 3 out of 10 ASEAN countries were invited. Indonesia, Philippines, and my country, Malaysia. Okay? The rest are not. So, and that is very telling and interesting. Why is that? We do know that when it comes to a strategic aspect, Vietnam and Singapore are the strongest like-minded countries. Stand up against China when it's necessary. But these two countries are not like-minded politically or ideologically. So the value-based and also the like-minded notion create more divergence rather than convergence. So to again to sum up would be like it's certainly important for internal and external reasons to emphasize the human rights and value based, but they are also equally important to emphasize the kind of a pragmatic
Mhm.
convergence that work better for many other countries. And it's not just about Southeast Asia, even about Five Eyes. We do know that, for example, New Zealand makes some distinction between value and also interest. Sometimes the two might not necessarily go together. And this is what I think Southeast Asia see the complexity of a big power relationship. We know where US come from when they want to push for value base, but again, it might create some challenges internally and externally. It's not sure.
Thank you. I can't resist commenting, even though we don't have much time left. I think there are some circumstances under which an active support of democracy, and of course, what we mean by democracy is a separate and very important topic, can be successful. I don't think we should argue that Southeast Asians are all realists. There are no idealists among them. And so an American idealist who comes in, saying, oh, we got to democratize, is not going to make it. The example I have in mind is Myanmar. We have had 2 visits so far from the National Unity Government of Myanmar. The foreign minister was at the last one. This is, of course, not the true government, the real government of Myanmar. This is part of the opposition, part of what started as a kind of rebellion and is increasingly looking like a revolution, and is frankly succeeding. The Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, as I say in Britain, is on its back feet. And I could go into those details. So this is a case where the future of authoritarianism in Myanmar is very much up for grabs. It's not an established fact, institutionalized for the foreseeable future, quite the contrary. And why shouldn't the United States support democracy? Without, of course, intervening to the point of violating international law. I'm not going that far. So that would be one example. The other thing I would say about this is that in some ways, David's question can be turned inward and made, a kind of question as to what does America think when it talks about democracy? And is it possible? And this is really, I'm affiliated with the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law down on the first floor, and we do have these conversations. One position is extreme, that there is no way in which freedom of speech can be altered or limited. Censorship is bad, right? This is actually, well, anyway, I won't get into domestic U.S. politics, but actually one might argue, look, I'll just end on this point. Imagine 2 different kinds of problems, okay? One is a mandate problem and the other is a cockpit problem. What do I mean by that distinction? The mandate problem relies on a mandate coming from a referendum, an expression of democratic choice that then is turned into policy. Example, a company wants to build a factory, right next to a river. The people who live next to the river are worried about it. They're worried about pollution and so forth. So the company says, well, let's find out what the opinion is. And obviously, to the extent that the opinion is, we want protection, then obviously that's an incentive for the company to make sure that there's no poison in the water and so forth and so on. And this is a democratic process. This is a kind of mini referendum. And there's enough time to have the consultation and make the decision. What is a cockpit problem? There's a pilot looking through the windshield. There's another plane coming at the pilot. He or she is not going to get on the public address system and say, oh, passengers, by the way, I'd like a vote on whether I should turn right or turn left. Now, the one person will be coming down to collect her ballot. Bam, it's done. They're all dead. To what extent, given the threat to the planet, are we moving away in some respects on some issues from mandate problems towards cockpit problems? To the extent that that is true, then it means that hyper-libertarian democracy is a disaster. The notion which used to exist in the days when, the Wild West was becoming less wild. Freedom is my right to swing my fist just half an inch short of your nose. That's the definition of freedom. That's what I stand for. In a densely populated wet rice society in Southeast Asia, that is suicide. That is a recipe for suicide. So I think Americans do need to consider what they mean by democracy and how well or poorly that definition fits into concrete situations, not just in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere in the world. I'm sorry, I talked a little bit too long there, but I think we're technically up at the end of our allotted time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate it.